Aubrey Jackson Solar. Um, and I'm the Associate Director for the Center for Social Science Scholarship. So in this capacity, I have this distinct pleasure of helping coordinate lecture series, workshops, including this one, focused on demonstrating your impact beyond academia. And this series invites experts from government, media, community organization, and academia to discuss how to translate their scholarship to non-academic audiences effectively. So to this end, we are incredibly fortunate to have our very own Dr. Arielle Kuperberg join us today. And before I introduce her, I would just like to give you kind of some center updates. One is that the next lecture in the series will be on February 4th and will feature Dr. Trent Steidley, who is a suicide prevention evaluator for the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment Office of Suicide Prevention. And he'll talk about his experiences both in academia as well as working in the applied public sector as it relates to his scholarship and broader public health research. So more broadly at the Center for Social Science Scholarship, CS3, our goal is to help amplify your work and connect it with audiences beyond the university, beyond academia. And we've developed a simple way to help you share your professional accomplishments with a broader public. So whether your achievements include sort of traditional academic outputs like journal articles or book publications, or more public-facing contributions like delivering legislative testimony, writing an op-ed, or responding to federal legislation, regulation, which seems very active right now, we want to help spotlight your impact. So we've created a short form. You can let us know how you'd like your work to be shared, and Amy has kindly put that link in the chat for us. You can also check out our website at socialscience.umbc.edu to find out more. And we encourage you to connect with us on social media. We're on LinkedIn, Blue Sky, Facebook, and Instagram. The handle is at UMBC SOC SCI. So now for our esteemed guest, Dr. Arielle Kuperberg is an associate professor in the Department of Sociology, Anthropology, and Public Health here at UMBC. And Dr. Kuperberg is a sociologist and demographer with expertise in the impact of student loans on young adults, college and young adult hookups, dating and romantic relationships, BDSM practitioners, cohabitation, marriage and divorce, and stay-at-home dads and moms. Her research has been published in leading sociology and interdisciplinary journals, including Social Forces, Journal of Marriage and Family, and Gender and Society. And she's received funding from the National Science Foundation. She also regularly appears in the popular media discussing her research in areas of expertise. And I think particularly relevant to today, Dr. Kuperberg is the co-chair of the Council on Contemporary Families, which is a nonprofit and nonpartisan organization of interdisciplinary scholars and practitioners who help connect the press and public with the latest research and best practices on about American families. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Arielle Kuperberg.
Thanks for having me, and let me figure out how to share my PowerPoint. Hold on. Okay, cool. All right, you guys could see that. Okay, cool. Yeah, so I'm Arielle Kuperberg. I'm an associate professor and associate chair in the Sociology, Anthropology, and Public Health Department, and I'm also the co-chair of the Council on Contemporary Families, which is an organization aimed at connecting research on family, accurate research on families, to the press and to the public. And a lot of the things I'm going to talk about today come from Council on Contemporary Families, more experts who are more senior than I am, particularly Stephanie Coons and Joshua Coleman, who both engage in the media a lot. So these are tips that I'm like, I wrote them down in my notes and now they're here for you. And I'm hoping you'll come away with some, at least a few practical tips that maybe you didn't know before in terms of talking to the public and writing for the public. All right, how do I go to my next slide? Okay, so why write for the public? One is I think a lot of us went into, at least in my field, I guess, but a lot of us went into academia in part to make a difference. We do research in areas that we think are important, and many have kind of policy implications. But your research can only make a difference if other people actually know about it. So getting public attention to your research is one way of kind of spreading information about your research to important stakeholders, so people who have an interest in your research findings. It's also a way to let other researchers know about your research. One of the earliest media things I did, I went to a talk by a really senior guy in my area, and he gave this whole talk on a paper that was basically a paper I had published like 2 years before in a leading journal like Social Forces, which is one of the leading journals in my field. And this guy had like come up with a new paper which basically did the exact same thing I had done 2 years earlier, but did not cite my research and had like no idea my research existed, even though it was in a leading journal. So that was what kind of first sparked my interest in getting involved with kind of publicizing my research beyond like people who happen to put the right keywords into Google Scholar or whatever. Um, and yeah, he actually, like, I went up to him and I was like, oh, I actually did a paper in a similar area. And he was like really gracious about it. And like a couple of weeks later, he hooked me up with a journalist who was asking him about that research project. And since then, like, the citations to that article really took off. A lot of people, it was in like multiple media articles. I was interviewed about it on NPR. And that was an article that was like 2 years old, so kind of like old news at that point. So it spreads awareness of your research, not only to, I thought it was an important research finding for like the public to know about, but also to other researchers within your own field. Um, and then, from a practical level, promotion and tenure. So I do want to say, like, peer-reviewed articles are kind of like the coin of the realm in academia. It doesn't matter how much media stuff you do if you don't have the peer review articles. But once you have the peer review articles, getting promoted and getting tenure, but especially getting promoted to full professor is often, I know at UMBC they care about like your national and international reputation. And one way you build that reputation is by having attention to your research. It's also, if you write for the public, it's a way to kind of control the narrative about your research. Sometimes journalists will find your research even if you're not particularly like publicizing it. Like some journalists subscribe to leading journals in their beat or whatever. And sometimes they will read your article but not really understand it, and I've had the experience of people posting like super wrong facts just because of like misinterpretation of statistics. So for instance, I had an article that was about it was about sexual identity, and how of the people who had a same-sex hookup, 1 out of 8 said they were heterosexual. That was like the statistic in my actual paper. But a newspaper reporter or a blog reporter or something found it, and they reported it as only 1 out of 8 college students identifies as heterosexual, which is like not the same thing at all. And that was like their big headline, and I was like, that is not what my research. I was like 1 out of 8 people who had a same-sex hookup, which is not 1 out of 8 college students. And I think part of the issue there was I didn't have anything written for the public about that article. I just had this kind of obscure academic article written with a lot of jargon and a lot of like statistical language, which is hard for journalists to interpret. So if you have important, findings, and many of us do have important findings, right? The kind of mode in which we write it up to talk to other academics is not a mode that is accessible to other people in the public. So translating it yourself means you are able to control like what is actually going into that narrative about, and you are like perhaps giving words to journalists who may like draw upon your own language when they're writing about your research in the future. Again, it won't let me click to the next one. Okay, so types of public research translation. There are many different ways in which you can translate your research for the public. So I'm going to talk about kind of the top line of these. So there's op-eds. Those are kind of opinion pieces that are published in newspapers or magazines or online. You could write an academic blog post about your research. You could write a brief report, which is kind of a shorter version of an academic article, but written for a public audience. You could talk to the press. Books, I think, are often a way that we translate our research for a more public audience, especially if you're writing like a crossover book that is aimed for both an academic and a more trade audience. You could write up a formal press release about your articles. I've done some of that. And we do have a communications office, I believe through the College of Arts and Sciences, or if not, UMBC more generally. So if you have research that's like super groundbreaking, like you know, discovered the cure for cancer or something, it's definitely worth talking to someone at a higher level and kind of like putting together a formal press release about your article. But often if having one of these other types of shorter pieces is enough, that like you could send something like a blog post to a journalist, and as long as you have the important information in there, they could get the key information they need. You could write a letter to the editor. Those are a little bit shorter, and usually, I don't know, the only time I've ever written a letter to the editor was when someone basically reported the exact opposite of my findings in an article and like quoted me, and I wrote a letter to the editor being like, no, that's the opposite of what my research actually found. You could write longer essays for the press. So one of my colleagues, Josh Coleman, who's a psychologist, he does research on parental estrangement. So he's always writing articles, kind of like his own essays, but based on his research, that are things like, oh, you know, with the new election, a lot of families are now estranged. So how do you deal with parental estrangement? Or the holidays are coming up and like some people won't be going home for the holidays. Like, how do you, like, you know, what does the research say about, you know, parental alienation, parental estrangement? So you could write essays for the press and pitch it to the press directly. You can do podcasts. Podcasts are super big now. There's also social media as a type of outreach to the public. There used to be a big academic community on Twitter. That's kind of died in recent years, but a lot of academics have migrated to places like Blue Sky. You could also have your own personal website for your lab or center. And I think more academics should be doing like TikToks and YouTube type videos, because I think young people don't read anything. And if you want to directly reach the public, I think TikToks are the way to go, basically. And I do know a few academics who are starting to do kind of like short little videos about what does the research say about this. Which I would love if people would do more of. But there's definitely room. I feel like that is the future of communicating science, and more scientists need to like, it's uncomfortable, I think, for many of us, but I think if you could get past that like initial discomfort and learn how to do it, it could be very valuable for spreading word to a huge audience. All right, so as I said, I'm going to mostly focus on kind of the top line there. So op-eds, blog posts, brief reports. These are three types of writing that I have a lot of experience with, and they all have a lot of similarities, but kind of subtle differences to them. So they're all about writing up your research findings in an accessible way that is understandable both to journalists and to the general public who journalists might be writing for. And also to other academics, to undergrads, like many college professors assign academic blog posts to undergrads to read. So they do have many similarities. They all feature your research findings as kind of evidence for what you're arguing for. All of them should have, like, one of the most important things about writing for the public is people have a very short attention span, and if your piece does not grab them in the first sentence or paragraph of, like, basically your first sentence of your piece, they'll just click on to the next thing. So one of the key, I think, one thing that's like super key and important in writing for any sort of public facing work is having some sort of attention getter or hook or something that kind of like, it hooks your audience, right? Like they want to know more, some sort of intriguing question or counterintuitive finding. Um, all these pieces are also written for a general audience. That doesn't mean like an unintelligent audience, but it doesn't mean like people who have a college degree necessarily. And another thing, just kind of like a formatting issue, is you never use in-text citations for any of these types, or footnotes for that matter, for any of these types of writing. Instead, you hyperlink directly to the source. So you would have a piece of writing and be like, here's my statistic, and then you would kind of like, the statistic, you'd click on that and it would go directly to the source of where that statistic came from. That's just kind of like a formatting issue. Okay, so hooks, as I said, having like a hook or an angle is one of the most important things. You don't, in academic writing, there's a lot of kind of setup before we get to the point, right? Like we may have an introduction that is like 2 or 3 pages long, and at the end of that 2 or 3 pages, we're like, and here's my actual research question. In public writing, as I said, you got to start and get right to the point right away. So start with something like intriguing. Your headline, your first sentence should be the most important thing. And you don't bury the lead. You don't have like several paragraphs of setup before you get to the point. You kind of like preview your point right away. So you have like first sentence is your hook, second sentence is like the main point of your piece. Or maybe like 2 sentences for a hook and like a third sentence that's like your main point. And then you may go back into other kind of like background information depending on what you're writing about. But that's like after you've already hooked their attention and after you've already basically said what your main point is. Sell the story, not you or your research. So writing for the public also, if the whole thing is about like, we were really interested in learning about blah, 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 and then like we went on a journey to like find out about this topic, it comes off as kind of like egotistic and you're like self-promoting, which can be a turnoff to public audiences. So it's more about selling like the story of your research, not selling like you yourself and your story or like why you're interested in that research project. It should be like why they should be interested in your research, not like why you necessarily, unless it's something that's like, broadly generalizable. And again, the topic should be kind of selling like, what did you find? What is like the important takeaway point versus like, here is like 17 things to know about my research methods, right? So methods, you should have like a little bit of methods, but it's more like, what is the story you're telling? What is like your point? And you need to have a point also. So one thing to think about right up front is like, who cares? Like, why should people care about the research that you're doing? So why will your audience care about it? Why will different stakeholders care about it? So that can include things like how many people does this specific issue impact? So I could say something like 40% of young adults have taken out student loans. And now there's a lot of problems with student loans or something, right? Can what you're doing research on improve people's lives? Can it increase their happiness or relationships or productivity or reduce any amount of suffering? These are all like potential hooks. You don't have to have like every single hook in every single piece, but think about like, people care to read about like what can make you happier, what can, reduce this problem you're having, how do you like improve your life. A lot of psychological research can lend itself to this, but a lot of other types of research, policy related research, can be related to this as well. What important problem does your research find? Also, like, what's really new about your research? What very impressive statistic do you have to prove your point? So if I was saying something about, student loans or something, I may be like, there's, borrowers have borrowed an average of $1.8 trillion in student loan debt, and it's the second most common form of debt after mortgage debt, right? These are like a couple of stats. They're not stats I specifically produced, but it says like, this is why you should care about this, right? Like, this is a big issue. This is like something that you should read more about. What's shocking, controversial, or counterintuitive? So if you're finding things that goes against what people may believe about your topic, and as someone who studies the family and relationships, there's a whole lot of beliefs about relationships that are like completely inaccurate when you look at the research. So what might be shocking or controversial, counterintuitive? Can you put your research into a kind of story that may make it more relatable to your audience? So your hook might be a story about a specific person that went through something that is like related to your research. Do you possibly have like a personal angle? And how personal you want to be and about what is kind of like a decision you have to make yourself. But I think certainly I've seen plenty of people write op-eds that talk about like from the perspective of someone working in academia or something, like here's my personal angle of like, you know, why we should have more funding for higher education or whatever it is. In terms of controversy, so how much you want to think about like how much controversy are you willing to deal with, and like what do you want to publicize and what do you not want to publicize? I can tell you when I first started doing stuff with the media, I had a colleague who was like, don't talk to the media. They're just gonna like, you know, spin what you say to like fit their own agenda, and like had this kind of like very hostile view to the media. I've never had a bad experience like that. I have been on like conservative radio shows, and they try to ask like gotcha questions and stuff, but they were like really easy to answer if you knew anything about the topic. But like most journalists are trying to get your story right. So they're not trying to like mislead the public with your statistics or something like that. They're trying to make sure they're reporting on your information as accurately as possible. But they do like controversy. So it's like kind of a matter to you in terms of what topics you're studying and how controversial they are in terms of how much you want to publicize them. So for instance, I have several colleagues who study trans issues, and some of them are trans, and they're just like, I don't want to write anything public about my research because whenever I do, I get like 400 hate emails and all these like hateful comments towards me. So that's like perfectly valid. If your research is getting a lot of pushback, like you don't have to be in the media. But, and yeah, I'm like, never read the comment section, basically. Definitely never respond to comments that people write about your research, right? I just like don't, I try and, it's hard not to read it, but I just try not to read the comment sections of newspaper articles about my research. But it is possible that you may get like, I've gotten weird emails over the years. Like I had a lot of media attention to a research project showing that cohabitation doesn't cause couples to get divorced. And I would get these weird emails from people who were like, I lived with my husband before marriage and we did get divorced. And like, let me tell you all this personal stuff about my relationship and like tell you why you're wrong and be like really angry about it. So I don't respond to those emails. But you can sometimes get them. And I'm like, every once in a while I hear of a colleague who got like some sort of threat and had to like involve security. But I would say that's like super rare. I know way more people who talk to the media regularly and haven't faced that kind of like extreme pushback. You can also tie your research into ongoing debates and controversies, especially if you are writing op-eds. Op-eds are usually to like give a specific opinion. So if you have a specific opinion about a policy topic that's in the news right now, that may be your hook, right? But again, like it's kind of up to you to think about like how much you're willing to tolerate and like what topics you want to engage with the public. Uh, here's some examples of like kind of teasers. You could also write like teaser titles to engage. So your hook itself could be your title, like the top 5 reasons why you should like whatever, what you need to know about getting divorced, 7 reasons why this is hurting your finances or something, the 6 best ways or 6 worst ways, or like true or false, right? So it is kind of like clickbaity, but it is, I mean, part of you're, you are trying to be clickbaity. Like you are trying to get people to like click on your links. So it does feel like kind of hokey and cheesy and weird to like write like this at first, but it is part of like writing for the public, is writing things that do kind of like hook people's attentions. Um, and here's just like a few examples of hooks from some of my brief reports that I've written. So recent discussions have focused on loan forgiveness as a remedy for growing student loan debt. How have their loans affected or not affected student lives? So it's like kind of a question like, ooh, I want to know more, right? For more than 100 years, Valentine's Day has been a time for a romantic candlelight dinner dates. But today, many observers worry romance and courtship are falling out of favor. According to the New York Times, traditional dating in college has mostly gone the way of the landline, replaced by hooking up, right? And then the article is about how people still do go on dates. In the last 50 years, the percentage of men and women who cohabit before marriage, living as sin as it was still called in the 1960s, has increased by almost 900%, right? So again, these aren't like what my article is about, but it's kind of like, oh, intriguing. Like, what do people say in terms of, how loans are affecting their lives? Or like, oh, traditional is dating dead. Oh, cohabitation has gone up so much. And then the next line is like, but does cohabitation cause couples to get divorced? Don't write like an academic, or you could write like a public facing academic, I guess. But academic writing is super jargony. It has a lot of insider language that people do not understand in the general public. It could come off as kind of condescending. The media prefers pieces that are written for a more general audience. You don't have to counter every argument or list every limitation of your research like you would in a research article. You also don't want to spend too much time focused on methods. So, and you may not give details that you would give in an academic paper. Like you may say like, using sophisticated statistical modeling techniques, we found that, like, instead of saying like, using a logistic regression or something, like you would never say logistic regression, but you could say like using sophisticated statistical analysis, which like is basically a general audience way of saying like a regression or something else, and then link to an actual scientific paper that has the details on the regression. So in terms of the stuff you want to have in the methods, it's mostly like, who did you talk to or survey or interview, or like, what did you look at? Like, what is the source of your research? How many people, if you like, I'm a social scientist, so I'm like talking to people, but like, how many people did you talk to? And like, what was their distinguishing characteristics? That is pretty much like all you need to know about methods, right? So like, we interviewed 46 people who graduated college with loans, about their experiences, and then go straight into the findings. So you don't want to give a lot of technical details that people don't understand it, and it just like it stops them from reading the rest of the paper. You can be more nuanced in an interview or in a longer article, but most of the things that you're writing for the public are going to be shorter, and you only want to have like 1 or 2 main points, and you want to kind of hammer those points in again and again. If you want to be like, but in this case or this limitation, that's for an academic article, or maybe if someone interviews you about your finding and wants to know more, you could bring up those nuances then. But you don't want to talk about like you want to talk about your main story, not about like side parts of your story that aren't really like central. This comes from Stephanie Kunz's list of words to never use in public writing. And these are all words, and I'm not saying these are things that are like bad to like write about. I do research on many of these topics, but these are just words that should not be in public-facing writing. So intersectionality, cisgender, postmodern, lived experience, heteronormativity. She's a family researcher, so a lot of them are kind of like family and gender related. Privilege as a verb, like she privileged this idea over that idea. Patriarchy or misogynistic. Norms, like I'm like, oh, social norms this, social norms that. Like the average person doesn't know what a social norm is. They don't know what socialization means. These are all like things that you had to explain in your introductory class in your field. Should not be in public facing writing. If it's on that like vocabulary list of keywords for like sociology 101 or geography 101 or whatever, if it's something you would have to take a college class to really understand what that word means, it should not be in a public facing writing. Theory, hazard, people talk about like hazard ratios or the hazard of getting married. And like I wrote that in an article once and Stephanie Coons was like, what do you mean the hazard of getting married? That sounds like someone's gonna like run you over with their car. Using the word significant as in either noteworthy or statistically significant, words like correlation or regression or holding constant or net of or we controlled for. There are ways to say these types of concepts if they're really key to what you talked about. So I did an article about students who are parents, and we talked about how they were much less likely to get help from their parents. So we said, well, part of this is because student parents tend to be older and come from poorer backgrounds. But when we compare people who are the same age and who come from similar backgrounds, we still find a big gap, right? So that is explaining a regression in a way that a general audience could understand without using the word regression or we controlled for age and parental background or something like that would go in an academic paper. But you could explain it in a way that like people could actually understand it. And think about your audience. So I think about it in terms of what you might tell your next door neighbor without having to remember any specific numbers or looking up a number to tell them. So if they're just like, what are you doing research on? Or someone on an airplane. Or I think about my grandmother who was like super intelligent as a human, but never went past 4th grade in formal education. So she was someone who I could talk about like sophisticated ideas, but she had never been to college or even high school. But is like, I'm not talking down to her, but I have to explain like every jargony word that you would only understand if you were a college student. But think about it like, most of you, I think, are professors who talk to undergrads on a regular basis about your field. So if you could explain your field to undergraduate students who, especially like intro level undergraduate students, you could explain it to the public because that is kind of the public as well, right? That is another kind of public facing work. All right, some little specifics, and I'm going to kind of speed through this because I'm like, I could just talk forever. So op-eds, these are opinion pieces that are usually published in newspapers or magazines. They're about 1 to 2 pages single spaced. The trick I heard is that your op-ed should have 3 S's, a statistic, a story, and a policy solution, right? So S for solution. A statistic, you don't want to have a ton of numbers. You want to have like 1 or 2 dramatic numbers, a story that personalizes what you are talking about, and some kind of policy solution to the issue you are talking about. Op-eds, usually you want to have a tie-in to current events, but that also can mean you have a very short turnaround because if there is something you're writing an op-ed on in the current news cycle and you don't get it published very quickly, like the news cycle moves on to the next story and it may no longer be timely. When you write an op-ed, you need to pitch it to a newspaper or a magazine. Often you could pitch it yourself. Like if you go to the New York Times op-ed website, they have instructions there on how to submit a potential op-ed. And they're like, we'll get back to you within 3 days. And if you don't hear from us, move on. We're not accepting it after 3 days or whatever don't quote me on the 3 days part, but they have like some short period of time that they're like, if you don't hear from us by then, you're not going to hear from us. And I've pitched to them and it got turned down, but I heard back very like 2 days later. And then often you have to pitch it to multiple places. So I'm not a huge op-ed writer, but the one op-ed I have done, I pitched to 3 different places. We sent it to the New York Times, Politico, and then The Hill, and it ended up getting published in The Hill. So, you know, it's good to have a list in your mind of like, not, I'm going to write this op-ed for the New York Times only. If you have a list of like a couple of alternative places, that might be a good place to send it to. When you send it in, you often want to have like a catchy title in the email you submit. That's kind of like your pitch too. Like it's like a shorter, like an even shorter version of your op-ed. If you are doing something policy related, I highly recommend getting involved with the Scholar Strategy Network, which I know have done other workshops for us here. They're like an interdisciplinary academic organization that's specifically focused on kind of policy related research. So, and connecting policy research to like politicians. They hooked me up with like a federal student loans testimony thing. But they pitched my op-ed that got into The Hill. So they actually did the pitching for me, and they edited the op-ed too and gave me like a lot of detailed feedback. So I don't know if they do that with every op-ed, but they've done it at least once. So that's a really good resource if you're interested in writing more op-eds. So op-ed, just quickly, it has a hook at the beginning. So here's a hook from an op-ed I wrote. Will he or won't he? And how much? That's what everyone's asking about. President Biden and student debt forgiveness. And you notice we like hyperlink to articles about news. We don't like have in-text citations. Then we go straight into our policy solution. So a legislative proposal would temporarily allow those with student loans to refinance them at 0% interest. Congress should not only pass this, they should expand it and make it a permanent policy. And then we just keep like hammering in that point in like many different ways. We also have stories from our research. So for the past 6 years, a participant in our research study has paid this amount. They've paid $86,000 so far, but they still owe $78,000 of their $105,000 loan. Woman in our studies started college older. She couldn't pay her bills, and it was only during the loan pause that she was able to pay off other debt, right? So kind of dramatic stories. Again, not too many stories, like 1 or 2, that drives home your point. And then we had a little bit about methods. We've been studying the experience of college graduates. We have nothing here about like number of people or what questions we ask them. We're just like, we talk to them about their student debt. And we have like our dramatic statistic about the number of student debt. And then our conclusion, we kind of drive home the point again of that, like we should canceling student debt, but if loans remain necessary, we shouldn't have interest. The end. Academic blog posts are very similar to op-eds, but they are possibly not as opinionated. Op-eds usually have like an opinion and a policy solution that's usually tied to that. Blog posts may more be about just like telling people about your article. You could discuss findings of a new article, or you could tie it into some sort of current event. Like I did an article on like 50 years since the LeClaire affair was a huge controversy when a woman lived with her boyfriend when they weren't married. What does the research say about living together before marriage? Is it actually a problem for relationships? Have 1 or 2 points, just like an op-ed. Don't discuss every single thing you found in your article if you're writing about a research article. In terms of where to post it, the societypages.org is a great social science blog that covers a number of different topics, and they're always looking for more posts. If you have family-related blogs, you could send them to my blog, the Council on Contemporary Families blog. You could have your own blog as well. And then a brief report is kind of a little bit longer than a blog post or an op-ed. It's usually 1 to 4 pages single spaced, but it is a short report based on your research that is written specifically for a more general audience. So it has a hook, and then you have your main takeaway point right away. You may have some like background lit review to this sort of packages your research with other people's research. So a journalist wanting to write about your research has some easy links to other research, other sources of related research. And then it talks about your findings, but again, not every finding from your research, usually like 1 to 2 main takeaway points. So I did a brief report on like, what did college students with loans say they would do if their loans were forgiven? And how do they say student loans are affecting their lives? So my main findings were kind of like 2 charts about like the lists of things they said they would do differently. The paper itself had like a lot more findings, and it also talked about like family stuff and like other statistics, and none of that went into the brief report version. These could be sent to journalists. You could also, there are many different organizations that publish them. Council on Contemporary Families does ones related to families. The Conversation is a great way to publish brief reports on research. Your own website, if you have a center or lab center for your research, that's also a great place. And I'm going to skip this, and then I'm just going to skip to talking to the press. So we have time for questions a little bit, but you can do outreach specifically to the press about your research. So if you write a brief report, you can go and send it around to media journalists and have like a little pitch in the newspaper article, like in the email, about like new research on this, and like, here's a brief report about my new research article on this. I'd be happy to talk more if you're interested in discussing this for a potential newspaper article. And you could send it to people who you know do research in your area. And once you make media contacts, you want to keep those contacts and like send them your new stuff when it comes out. You could also, you could do kind of cold calling. You could go through the press office at UNBC. And you also want to have like a website set up, or potential like brief reports, fact sheets, blog posts that the media can find on their own. I have been contacted like many times by just journalists like finding my website or finding an article without me like specifically trying to pitch it to anybody. And when the press does call, so first of all, the call will be an email. Nobody just calls you because they don't have your phone number. They will email you and ask you to set up usually a phone call still. Journalists haven't moved to Zoom for everything the way academics have. So they still call you, but they will email you to set up a phone call, and you usually want to give them times you're available within the next day or 2. If not, like 2 days out is a little bit far. Many journalists have very tight deadlines. They may be calling you today for a deadline they have tomorrow at noon, or that night at 10 p.m. or something. And if you don't get back to them right away, they will just go down their list to the next person on the list. You're not like burning a bridge, but you're like missing an opportunity. So if you are responsive and get back to people quickly, and not just be like, I'm going to put this aside and get back to them on Friday or something, like get back to them right away, be available. You can prepare. It's a good idea to prepare in advance. If you're talking to a journalist, you could ask them specifics about what they want to know about. And then if it's like, I get contacted both about my own research, and now that I've like kind of established a little bit of a reputation, I get contacted about random other stories too. So if I get contacted, like someone did a story on like Baltimore population growth or something, and they were like, you're a demographer, right? And I'm like, sure. But I looked up some information on that before I talked to them, because I don't actually know that much about Baltimore population growth, but I'm a demographer and I know how to look up information on populations and statistics. So if you are like, often you are a resource, and part of your skills is the ability to look up other people's research. So that's not cheating, it's like preparing. And often if I look up something, so if it's not on my research in specific, if it's my research, I'll go back and look at my article beforehand and maybe write down some key statistics before I talk to the journalists. If it's someone else's research, I'll write down a few key points, like a few takeaway points on a piece of paper, and just like have that piece of paper right in front of me when I'm on the phone call. so that helps you be more prepared. It helps you not ramble as much. As you can tell, I could be kind of wordy. So it helps keep you on track. And then finally, if you're on the phone, try to keep it short and simple, get to the point. It's okay to like stop talking and not like, as I said, I could be, when I was first talking to journalists, I would just like they would be silent and I would just like keep talking to like fill the silence. You don't have to do that. Just like say your point and end it. Be friendly. So the first thing I do whenever a journalist calls me, they're like, "Oh, is this Dr. Kuperberg?" And I'll be like, "Oh, you could call me Arielle." Or, "Oh, like call me Arielle." So like be like, "Oh, I'm not like a snooty academic who's going to be like, call me Professor Kuperberg or something." Develop ongoing relationships. So at the end of a phone call, I'll say, "Oh, when I have, I do some other research on blah, blah, blah that's related to this topic. When that article comes out, do you want me to send you a copy?" And they always say yes. They may not cover it, but sometimes they do. And I always recommend other people so that I could become kind of a resource for the journalist of like, if they're trying to find something on this topic, I'm not like, I feel like it shows that you're not just trying to self-promote, you're also kind of like a good resource that they could come back to again and again. And you could connect them to other people in your field who are also doing similar research. Send occasional updates and save their contact info. I have an email folder in my like Google account that's like media contacts, and I just save everything automatically to that folder. Although there is a lot of turnover in the media now, so a journalist contact from 2 years ago may no longer be someone who's a journalist anymore. And that's it. I feel like I took longer than I said I was going to take, but sorry. I do have time for questions. I'm like, I could stick around a little bit longer. I don't know if the other people can, but
Yeah, absolutely. We have about 12 minutes. Thank you. So if you have questions in the chat, or if you just want to raise your little virtual hand, and we can go from there.
sun's chasing me.
So while people are thinking, I have a question for you. It's sort of the opposite. So you've kind of told us how to jump in and offer expertise in different ways. Have you come across a situation where you've had to decline or realize that, oh, maybe I should not have agreed to this?
I almost never decline things. I sometimes, if it's like they're clearly trying to like fish for something, I feel like I've declined something like twice in my life when they were like clearly trying to fish something, or it was something that was like super not my area and I just was like so overloaded with other things. I'm just like, I don't have time to research this right now. Like, but here's someone else who I could recommend who you could talk to instead. So I would always recommend somebody else. I have declined a couple of things, but I also think, not to be like patriarchal about or whatever, but I feel like I have a friend who's like, "What would a man do?" And there's always like male academics who will like comment on things that are like super out of their area. And I'm like, well, I have expertise and I have the expertise to look up information about things that are like not precisely like square in my area, but are, something I teach about in class. So I will always try to look up something. Because again, if you don't contribute, at least in my field and family, there is like kind of this little contingency of people who do have a specific agenda and like kind of like a moralistic agenda when it comes to families, and they have PhDs and they are happy to talk to the media all the time. So if I'm not contributing, like who is the media talking to and like what kind of information is getting out of there? So I do feel like it's kind of like a public responsibility too to like make sure the record is correct. So yeah, I saw someone's hand was up. Pamela?
Hi, thank you so much for the information that you shared. A question, have you ever had the experience of being unsatisfied with the way something you shared with the journalist was represented in the media? And if you have, what do you do about that? Is it like don't read the comments, don't respond, just leave it? try to be clearer next time, or what is your approach to that?
I gotta say, like, people I have directly talked to, the journalists, I have not had that experience, but I have had the experience of like people pick up your research and don't talk to you and then like talk about it, but it's kind of like a game of telephone, and they like will quote a quote that you said like totally out of context, or they said, 1 out of 8. I don't know if you were here when I gave this example, but I had a group that were like 1 out of 8 college students are heterosexual, when that was like not the finding of my research. I also had, so I had this article that showed that cohabitation, living together before marriage, doesn't cause you to get divorced. And I had a newspaper article was like, and this research shows that you shouldn't live together before marriage unless you want to get divorced, basically. So like basically the complete opposite of what my research showed. It kind of depends on the level of the venue. So some of the like wrong stuff about heterosexual students was like blogs. So I did not really bother to correct it because there was other people. I did tweet about it, so I was like, I'm on the record being like, this is inaccurate. But I didn't like, they had never talked to me directly. They didn't quote me directly. So, and yeah, sometimes I just don't have the bandwidth to like fight those fights. So I was just like, whatever. But then in the cohabitation example, that was in like the Deseret News, which is like a major newspaper. It's like the newspaper of Utah, basically. So I ended up writing a letter to the editor to kind of like correct the record. If people who are journalists get things blatantly wrong, and again, I'm like, the main thing they've gotten wrong is like my title and spelling my name has been like, I was like, the number one thing they get wrong is like putting a U for Kuperberg instead of an E for Berg, or calling me a professor when I'm technically an associate professor or something like that. I don't really bother with correcting. I don't bother with correcting spelling or anything like that. But yeah, if it was something, if they're like, this research clearly shows you shouldn't live together before marriage or you're going to get divorced, and my research is like literally the opposite, that I kind of like wrote a letter to the editor. So yeah, I'm like, it's kind of like a personal choice. Like when that other thing came out, I didn't really have as much of like the bandwidth. I had other stuff going on in my life. So I was like, I could write a letter, but it's just a blog. Like, what are like 20 people going to see this? So like, but I will tell this story forever.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question.
Yeah, some of the biggest mistakes that researchers can make when first starting talking to the press. I feel like you shouldn't be too intimidated about like making mistakes. I would say just like kind of be prepared and don't get too into the weeds when it comes to things like methods and statistics and like trying to explain theory like that. You're like, let me go on along, like, let me explain hegemonic masculinity theory to a journalist. Like, that's just wasting both of your time, really, because they're not going to quote you on that, and it's getting away from the point. So I think like it's easy, especially if you're like I'm the type of professor who just like gets up and rambles in front of my students for long periods of time, right? If you're that type of professor, it might be easy to like get off track and like start talking about things that don't have to actually do with your point. So I think like keep you on track and like not preparing at all, like not knowing your own research, which yeah, you think like I wrote the paper, like surely I'll remember it when I'm on the spot. But if you have like a number or something, like I don't remember numbers when I'm on the spot talking to someone. So I think just like maybe not being prepared. Um, but yeah, I'm like, you are the expert also, and journalists want to get your story right, and they'll often like come back and check with you later and be like, I wrote this, like, are you sure is this like accurately representing what you were like trying to say? Um, often, yeah, I'm like, often they use my words as their own words, and don't quote me on it, and I'm just like, whatever. Like, at least the truth is getting out there. So there may be things like that annoy you, but that you just have to kind of let go, I think. But yeah, just being very, make sure you're responsive and prepared is like responding as quickly as possible to people and being prepared when you do have, and like you'll usually have at least a few hours to like look some stuff up or like look up the main number from your article or something like that.
Great, thank you. I think we actually have time for one more short question, if anyone.
Too much sun.
Okay, I have one. Do you do TikToks yet?
I do have a TikTok, but that's because my daughter has one, so I want to make sure I could like see what she's posting. And I think I have 3 TikToks. So I don't personally do TikToks, but I've done some YouTube videos. Yeah, I'm like, I feel like people should be doing it, just maybe not me. But someone out there should be doing that. Because I'm just like, young people, they get so much information and there's so much misinformation. Like there's this whole trad wife thing, and there's a whole like bunch of research about, how being a trad wife could like lead to all these bad consequences. But they're not getting that. They're getting like, look at my amazing bread that I baked on TikTok or whatever in my $4,000 oven. And that like, again, young people don't read. Like they're not reading newspaper articles. They're getting their information from these videos. So I think it's like, I think the whole media landscape is kind of changing, where now people talk about like legacy media, and that by that they mean like the New York Times or like Time Magazine or something like that. And that's like legacy as in like old media. And I think increasingly the movement is we have to become like content producers versus like relying on the old media to like find us and write about us in an article that like, again, nobody's going to read. It's behind a paywall. Maybe they have like their small audience of older, wealthy, educated people who like pay for their subscription who could read that. But I think as academics, we can have like a much wider impact if we like go directly to where people are. And I think TikTok is where people are. I mean, it may be some other platform in the future, but that is where people are getting information right now. So I think I'm like, we should do more of that. Like, I'm getting for our next workshop, CCF has we did a workshop at UMBC last year, and we're going to do one in Utah next year. And we're getting a TikToker guy specifically for the next one to like train us. I'm like, I got to get my 12-year-old to like train me how to use TikTok. She could do all these amazing video editing things. I'm like, that's crazy. I don't know how to do any of that. So
I look forward to seeing what comes out of that.
yeah.
We are at about time. Thank you so much for joining us and for all of the information you gave us. This was certainly helpful. And I love your kind of enthusiasm and confidence and kind of, there's this sort of like easygoing, like, oh, just let it go. And I really appreciate that. It's very lovely to hear.
All right.
So thank you, everyone. I encourage you to check out our next speaker on February 4th, and have a good rest of the week.